The joy of knitwear is that you can do it in wool or cashmere or cotton, and then all of that is more sustainable. It's increasingly there's a lot of recycled options.
With fall upon us, I thought what better time than now to talk about all things knitwear with my special guest, freelance knitwear designer Kate Knight. Kate's journey has taken her from academia to the bustling fashion scenes of New York and London, working for some notable companies like Nordstrom, J. Crew, and Ralph Lauren, to name a few. In this episode, Kate explains the intricate process of designing knitwear, from the selection of sustainable fibers to insights on creating knitwear collections, sourcing materials, and working with factories. If you're looking to incorporate knitwear in your fashion collection, this is the episode for you, my friend. So without further ado, here's my episode with Kate Knight. Hi, Kate. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here.
Hi, Jasmine. No, thank you very much for having me. This is really lovely.
Yes. So I'm just so excited to talk all things knitwear, and you are the perfect person to ask about all of our burning knitwear questions. But before we get started, I want to get a little idea of your background and how you found yourself on the knitwear side of fashion.
So I would sometimes describe myself as a reluctant fashion designer. It took me a while to kind of come into the industry. I did a degree in textiles and specialized in knit. So I think we're a slightly different breed, the knitwear designers. And a lot of us might have done our degree in textile design and then kind of come into fashion a bit later. And so I was at University of Leeds and was going to do a PhD and have an academic career, and then realized that I was going to be bored witless. So I remember sitting in my supervisor's office and he said, "Why don't you write a history of each fiber?" And I thought, God, that sounds dull. All right. And I and I sort of had this idea. So my dad was American and I had an American passport since birth. And I had this idea that I might move to New York. And it sort of that was enough to sort of start looking at flights. And so I moved over there, got a job, got tossed around in the New York fashion industry for a couple of years, and then landed working at a big cashmere supplier called DZ Group. Worked with them for 3 years and then moved back to London, be closer to my parents, and worked for them, setting up the London office. And so I did that. And then I've been freelancing for about 3 years now, working with small brands, independent startups from my house in France.
That's amazing. You've been all over the place.
Yeah, this is my fourth country. And I'm also married to an American. So we joke that our daughter is half American, half British, and mostly confused. Um,
It's so funny because I feel like the people listening to this podcast were so confused when you said you were American, but you have this British accent and you're living in Paris to an American husband who you met in London.
then, yeah. And in between, we did a stint in Switzerland. So that's,
Wow.
yeah,
That is
yeah.
so funny. I love it. And I love hearing about your background. I'm curious if you were to give like the definition to knitwear, because I think, people, when they think about knitwear and fashion, it can feel like, oh, is it like, we have wovens and we have knit fabrics and then there's knitwear. So like how would you define what knitwear is?
Yeah, it's really confusing, and it's really confusing for someone coming into the industry when people sort of throw knitwear around willy-nilly
Mm-hmm.
for knitted fabrics. So you can have jersey or interlock, those sorts of fabrics, or you can have fully fashioned sweater knits, as the Americans say. And basically, the difference between, say, a jersey knit t-shirt and a knitted t-shirt is that on with knitwear or sweater knits, it's been fashioned on the machine.
Mm,
So when it comes off, if you like, the pattern has already been made rather than cutting the pattern out of a long length of fabric.
right.
And that's really the sort of fundamental difference. Knitted fabrics and knitwear.
Yeah. So what I'm wearing would be considered, if you're watching on YouTube, what I'm wearing would be considered knitwear. But if you're wearing like a t-shirt, like a cotton Hanes t-shirt, that would be called knit fabric, right? Like a
Yeah,
jersey knit.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. And that's the confusing part because they're so similar and they are totally different processes, very different processes. But obviously the joy of knitting is that both give you stretch and ease and comfort when you're wearing it.
Yes.
Um,
And we love stretch.
and we love stretch.
I want to get more into that process and like what the difference looks like because I think primarily a lot of designers start with cut and sew, and with knitwear there's so many different techniques and just a difference in how it's designed and how you do the tech packs and all of that. So I want to get into that, but first I'm curious for you as a freelance designer, because your job is to help brands bring their ideas to life. And so I'm curious about what that process looks like for you when you're working with designers looking to create knit collections. What does that look like?
One of the things I love genuinely about freelancing is that every client is a little bit different and every project is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes they can come to me and say, like I recently had one where she was quite a prolific hand knitter and she was like, I've got to the point now where I want to translate those hand knits into machine knits. So my job was to sort of, she knew what she wanted in hand knits and I sort of translated that into machine knit language. It can be that, it can be, sometimes people can come and say, oh, I want a basic capsule collection and I can design that. Or I recently just finished a project with a bodybuilder brand. And so he wanted bigger specs through the shoulders and chest for a knitted hoodie. So it can be that sort of specific. I also have done a sock project this year, sustainable socks. And really, yeah, it's all over the place. And I really like that.
Yeah. And so if let's say a designer has this idea for, maybe they want to do some kind of sweater and they're not natural designers, right? A lot of people aren't naturally designers, but they have ideas about what they want to do and all of that. Where somewhere they can go to find inspiration? How would they bring that to you to get it translated into design? Sometimes they may probably come forward with pieces that are not even originally knitwear pieces, but they want to transform them into knitwear. So what does that look like?
Again, yeah, I'll take anything in any format.
Mm.
It can be a napkin sketch, it can be a Pinterest board, it can be like, let's Frankenstein something together with the neck from here and the sleeves from here. And then I would sketch that up in Illustrator, send that over. I always include 2 rounds of revisions. And then once we're happy with it, once it's nailed, sometimes we hop on a call and they'll be like, make it a bit longer, and I make it a bit shorter, change the colors. So once that's happy, then I move on to the tech pack stage and create a tech pack.
Yeah, that's great because I feel like that's so relieving for someone who is a napkin sketcher and doesn't really know how to realize that, to have someone that knows not only how to design but also knows how knitwear kind of functions and what needs to be considered and all of that. And also you're doing tech packs, so you can think about the measurements and like how big does the armhole need to be for a knitted piece compared to a woven piece or a cut and sew piece or whatever it may be. So I think that's so beneficial.
Yeah, it can change with the stitch as well. Different stitches need different amounts of these the measurements. It's also, I try to advise, and it's a fine line between, so for instance, I've got a project at the moment where it's a jacquard with 6 colors and he wants to do 3 different colorways, so that's 18 colors, and I'm trying to get him to use some of the colors across different colorways to help with minimums, so that the factory doesn't lose their mind. And it's that kind of backwards and forwards talking it through of like, I'm not saying you can't do 18 different colors for one. It's going to be a lot.
Yeah, you have to kind of be strategic in that way, don't you? And I love that too, because you're kind of advising them and helping them to think in that strategic way and potentially save money and relationships.
Yeah, it's a fine line, as I'm sure you're aware of, like not wanting to crush their idea, but also trying to make it commercially viable, that something that can go through a factory and be produced and ultimately be sellable for not $1 million.
Yes, exactly. You want people to be able to actually afford it.
Yeah. So it's walking that line.
Yes. And so for those people who don't really know all the terminology and all the like different things you can do, Would you say, because the first thing I think of is like, okay, maybe going into a store and, finding different knitting techniques that you kind of like just off of visuals, right? Or like going onto Pinterest or wherever it may be. Do you find that helpful to like just have all those references for people that don't really know how to articulate? Because some people might not know, like, what is jacquard or like, what are these things? And haven't had the formal fashion education, which is where you come in, but how helpful are those references?
Yeah, sure, totally. And that's what, again, one of my pet peeves that, again, people will sort of throw around terms so half cardigan is the same as fisherman's rib. But the most helpful thing is not to get into the name of it, but just to show me what you want, because then I can put that in the tech pack. Because usually the factory, as you don't want to get hung up on words. You want to show them rather than tell them. So yeah, if someone has a stitch they like, yeah, a photo or Pinterest board or whatever is much
Yeah.
more helpful than saying shake a stitch or whatever.
Yeah. And I
um,
find that when the more visuals you give and the more references, like the easier the process is. You don't have to go back and you know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah. And again, that's what the factory are looking for, is they're looking for visuals, and it's something that doesn't have to go through Google Translate and come out with sort of mangled soup of all those terms. But again, it's one of those people can get hung up on different terminology, which is one of my pet peeves. So I'm like, just yeah, go on with it.
Yeah.
Mm.
So you don't have to try to figure everything out. Just give a picture or a sample. That's really relieving, actually. So I'm curious when it comes to transitioning from like cut and sew pieces to full fashion knit, or even like I know we spoke about before, some people will think it's the same process of like buying a knit fabric because sometimes we see knit fabric on rolls which can be sewn together. I'm just curious about what the difference between the like manufacturing process is between that, or even the tech packing process and all of that between cut and sew, and then the full fashion knit.
So the big one is that you're choosing a yarn rather than a fabric, because the fabric of the garment is going to be created at the same time as the actual garment itself. So there's kind of two main groups of knitting. So you can have fully fashioned flatbed knitting, where the garments come off and you've got a front and a back and a sleeve, and they're not sewn together, they're linked together. And that's a special kind of machine that uses, the other big difference is you don't use sewing thread, you use the yarn that you've used to knit the body. So it can ultimately be more sustainable, because if you knit in, say, organic herb dyed merino, then that's fully compostable without, you'd literally be left with the label. There's no sewing threads or anything like that. So comes off the machine. This is flatbed knitting, and you've got front back sleeves, and they get put together. Or you can have seamless knitting, so where it's knitted a bit like a sock, basically knitting a tube. You're knitting the body, and then you get to the sleeves and you start knitting another two tubes that then come together to make a sweater, which is, the technology has been around for a long time, but the machines are more expensive. So fewer people offer it, but it's becoming more and more commercially viable. And sorry, you were saying about the tech pack. So I guess the other big difference, you start with a yarn rather than a fabric. It's still the same that you've got the measurements, you're telling where you're taking those points of measurements, what they're going to be, but you don't need a pattern. That's sort of the big difference. So you
Mm.
wouldn't need a pattern maker. And that's, I think, the main difference.
And so you were saying that you don't need a pattern maker. So as far as the sampling process works,
Mhm.
would that just be the measurements from the tech pack just be given to the, knitting factory and then they translate the measurements just straight to design instead of doing the pattern?
Yeah. So what happens is they'll take, so say you've given the cross chest as 17 inches, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
They're gonna knit a swatch in the stitch in the yarn, and they're gonna figure out, let's say it's 7 stitches per inch, and times that by 17 to get the number of needles they need to put into action to knit a 17-inch chest measurement sweater. Does that make sense?
Yes. And so would this be the same factory that you would probably manufacture with? Whereas to, a lot of cut and sew, they'll do this at one place and then do something at another place.
Yeah, so generally you would find a factory, send them the tech pack or send them the idea, and
Mm-hmm.
then they would say, okay, yep, this is the cost. We'll make a sample. So some factory, I'm sure it's the same with cut and sew. Some factories don't charge for the sample, just charge for shipping. The other thing that I know can stop some people is that the minimums tend to be higher with knitwear because of having to get the yarn in, because of that kind of maths, if you like, of having to work out the stitches and do the program.
Yeah.
So that can stop people from doing knitwear.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially people who are newer and kind of looking to test out the product and not bring a whole bunch of inventory on right away. So I'm thinking when you are working with these knitwear factories and you've made your sample and all of that, I kind of want to get into sourcing. Can you source from these factories that are, also knitting? And then as far as sample sourcing, like what does that look like? Can you enlighten us on the whole sourcing process? Because you are working with yarns. So it's not like you can order like, a yard or 2 yards of fabric. Like what does that look like?
So yarns tend to fall broadly into either Italian, European yarns or Chinese yarns. This is a huge exaggeration. There are other yarns,
Yeah.
just sort of, and depending on if you want to work in the States or in Europe or in China, it's obviously easier and simpler to use Chinese yarns for China, European yarns in Europe.
Hmm.
And so I would usually recommend, or sometimes the factory would have, say, if you wanted a fine gauge merino, then I would say, okay, here's a good yarn mill. I've used them lots of times. They're RWS certified, so that means the sheep have been taken care of.
Mm.
They haven't had mules in. I don't know if you know about mules in, although that's so merino sheep have, if you've ever seen a picture of merino sheep, they have folds of skin around their bum and they can get this horrible infection called blowfly
Oh
where
no.
they get all infected and it's all nasty. So there is a practice where they shave off these folds of skin, which is obviously traumatic for the sheep.
Right.
But then they don't get blowfly, which is also traumatic for the sheep. But pretty much everybody now doesn't mules, and they can control the blowfly with antibiotics and treatments and things.
Wow.
That's a consideration if people are trying to, look to that sustainable thing. Because obviously it's more expensive to control the blowfly with antibiotics and so on. And then so if I was to recommend a yarn, or maybe the factory recommend a yarn, it would be usually a 1 kilo minimum. So roughly one sweater is about 200, 300 grams. So you can get roughly two or three, well, 3 to 4 sweaters out of a kilo.
Gotcha.
So that's usually, but you would need more for sampling because they have to knit the swatches and figure out what's going on. And then it's costed. So the cost is worked out by the weight. It's basically the weight of the fabric, the weight of the finished garment, obviously. And then they will throw in there. It's sort of wrapped up the time it takes on the machine.
Yeah. And then as far as the yarn goes, like how would a designer like know what to even look for? I guess is it the same process of like having a sample of something that you really like, that you like the hand feel? Because I think it's probably maybe difficult to think about like, or I know a lot of factories have maybe headers that have different threads that you can feel and, get familiar with. But then you also can't get a full idea of what the finished garment's going to feel like until you maybe make the sample. So any tips or insights on that?
So one thing we haven't touched on is gauge. So gauge, it relates to the weight of the gauge is the number of needles on the machine per inch. So
Okay.
if someone talks about a 3 gauge sweater, then that's a heavy gauge chunky knit. If someone talks about a 14 gauge sweater, then that's a fine gauge lighter knit. So usually by the time someone's talking to me, they'd be like, I like this. And I'll say, okay, that looks like a 12 gauge. And then I will suggest yarns that will fit a 12 gauge machine. It's basically you choose a yarn that fits the machine, and then that has low minimums. And then there's the color card. So usually you can pick from the color card the colors you like for your first sample. And, a factory, so one of the things, knitwear factories are specialized in that they generally just do knitwear, and that's kind of their thing. And a good factory will guide you through all of that.
I'm curious too, like when we're talking about sourcing and finding the right thread, how can you avoid things like piling and things like that? Or even things that happen when maybe you've purchased a sweater in the past that has, loose threads coming out of it or things like that. How do we avoid some of those pitfalls when it comes to manufacturing our own goods and wanting to bring this really great quality product to market?
So it sort of starts with the fiber. Pilling is when the little tiny fibers are attracted to each other and they come together and make the balls. So the longer fibers, if you imagine a longer fiber can be twisted into a yarn, and then fewer fibers can come out to attract. So it's this kind of interplay between the fiber length, which is then being spun into a yarn. You can also, this rarely happens, especially at the startup level, but you can twist a yarn more tightly so that fewer fibers come out. And then you can knit a garment more tightly. So again, it's this sort of Goldilocks approach of you want it loose enough to feel soft, but firm enough not to pill. And really it's down to those sort of different parameters, how much something's going to pill.
Would you communicate that through the tech pack? Like, how would you communicate those details of how it needs to be twisted? Or
I wouldn't so much, the twisting would happen more at the yarn stage, but what you can get into is, so for instance, I've just finished a modest muslin project, and obviously for that she really didn't want anything see-through, so we're going to get swatches in different tensions on the machine to make sure that it's opaque.
Gotcha.
That can be a machine setting, and you can knit the same yarn tighter so that we get that kind of just right, not see-through, but still soft hand feel.
Yeah. And that's something you guys are communicating, right?
Yeah. Normally, that was a specific project, but normally the factory will knit a couple of swatches, be like, okay, turn it up, turn it down on the tension and get that right hand feel, but you can get into it. You can also knit, so what you can do is do something called knitting off gauge, where you knit a yarn for a 12 gauge on a 7 gauge, so it's super open. And you see that sometimes in scarves, and that's the benefit of that is it's cheap because it weighs less and it feels really soft, but it does pill. So you can sort of go the other way and knit it slightly tighter tension for the yarn on the gauge.
Yeah. And those swatches that you're talking about, you can request those before getting the garment fully made, right?
Yes, totally. And I do advise that. And also if you've got a fancy stitch that you're not sure about or anything really, you can ask to see a swatch before you see a garment.
Yeah.
And that's, I'd recommend that. If there's something unusual or a jacquard or something that is in some way different.
Yeah, I feel like that's super wise because you don't want to be wasteful in creating all these samples that are not working. And to see a swatch, you can actually see what the weave is looking like or the knit are looking like. And I think that's super helpful.
Totally, yeah.
So this is what I wanted to ask you too about, when we were creating these knitwear pieces, and I have this favorite, this is something personal, but I think it'll be helpful for people looking to design because we want to avoid things like this if it's avoidable. So I have a lovely lounge knit set, and there's a lot of snagging that's happening. And I'm wondering if that's anything that could have been prevented in the manufacturing process, in the thread that we choose, any of that. So is there a way around selling pieces that are going to be easily snagged? What are your thoughts on that? Hey, fashion entrepreneur. Did you know that at makegoodfashion.com, we've curated a library of free resources to help you uplevel your fashion business? Yep, that's right. Just head over to makegoodfashion.com and hit free resources to gain access to our selection of checklists, guides, and downloadable PDFs to help you on your fashion business journey. We have resources to help you find a manufacturer, production checklist, brand identity style guides, and much more. So make sure to head over to makegoodfashion.com or hit the link in the description to get your hands on those resources. Now back to the episode.
So I don't know what the knit stitch is, but if you've got long what are called floats, then that is something that can snag. So if you do children's wear, actually there are regulations where you can't have floats over a certain length.
And
So
what are
it doesn't
floats? What is that?
Floats.
Yeah.
So if you think about the back of a terry knit, when you get those sort of lines where the yarn's just going across.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have a float jacquard, or you can have a stitch that has floats in it. I don't know if your lounge set has.
I gotta look at it now. I should have brought it.
Send me a picture.
Yeah. Tell me what went wrong. Yeah.
So people do send me pictures of swatches and what is this stitch?
Yeah. And I think that's helpful too, showing what you don't want to happen and then finding a way to work around that, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it sounds like send me a picture later, but it might just have floats that then catch on things as you're moving around. But it is also, you will always get more pinning down the side, and if it's a pair of trousers, where your body rubs.
And do you think people choose yarns like that cause the piling and all of that to save money? Is it more affordable to get yarns that have that effect?
If you've chosen a cheaper yarn, it might have shorter fibers that then can escape from the yarn more easily and cause pilling. But what should have happened before it went to market is they do something called a Martindale test, where basically they take it and rub it for an amount of time, and you get a score 1 to 5. It should be over 3 for commercial selling.
Yeah. And would you do that the sample phase?
Yeah, you can do it at that stage, or before you sign off your TOP, before you go into production.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that's super needed. And is that something that the factory usually takes care of, or would you outsource that into a testing factory?
You'd have to ask the factory, and sometimes that would be an extra charge to go to the testing facility, to send your piece of fabric away to the testing facility, and then you'd get a score back from there.
Yeah, which I feel like is worth it. I think a lot of times we try to cut corners and skip steps to, maybe keep the costs down or whatever it may be. But then if you bring a product to market that is having these issues, you are, you're risking potential repeat buyers and all of that stuff. So I think that's so important to consider too, getting this tested, putting that into the costing, all of that, so you can avoid any mistakes there.
Totally, yeah.
And then do you have any tips on how to find a good factory? I think that's one of the challenging questions that everyone has. It's like, how do I find a factory when it comes to cut and sew or knitwear? So any tips on that?
Obviously you can talk to me, but beyond that, there's good old Google, there's LinkedIn, Instagram, put in a search for knitwear factory. And then my advice would be the same way that you would if you were hiring a plumber or something like that, talk to them, see if you can get them on a Zoom. The second that something gives you a red flag, get out of there. If they take too long to reply to emails or whatever, there's a good factory, so much of it, of course, is down to communication. So they could be a specialist or whatever. There's also a number of those sourcing platforms, depending on where you want to be looking in the world. So you can do Alibaba, there's ForSource, you can try those. But, obviously ask the sort of obvious questions of like MOQs and if they have certifications. But I also recommend just developing a relationship with them and talking to them, and you start to get a sense with them.
Yeah. And is there any specifics you should be asking? Like, should you be asking for samples of past work or things like that? Because how would a designer know that this factory is legitimate? Like, let's say they are responding quickly and all of that, but have they done good work in the past? So what kind of questions would you ask to kind of flesh that out?
what you can do is if they say, we've worked with these 10 different brands, you could do a LinkedIn search, find someone who's working at that particular brand. So you can, obviously, if you ask the factory for references, they're going to give you a client who's happy. But if you can find someone to talk to who has worked directly with that brand and say, how were they on communication? Did production run on, not did production run on time, but how was production? Did you get returns? You can ask all of these kinds of questions. So it's about doing your homework and then, which is where, of course, if you can get a referral from somebody, then that kind of cuts out all that legwork for you.
Yeah, which is so nice. And what kind of certifications should a designer be looking for? I think especially for, a lot of our listeners here are looking to do things ethically and do things in the best way possible. And so I'm wondering what certifications they should be looking out for, if you can think of any on the top of your head.
So again, with sustainability, it's about choosing what's important. I guess, as you know, it's this sort of really broad church of it can be, are the workers treated well? Or is the cotton organic? All of these different things. So to my mind as well, though, it's a tricky one because the certifications can cost so much money for the factories. But particularly if you're talking to a really small factory that's might be in Mongolia or Nepal somewhere. So I had a conversation a couple of months ago with a hand knit factory in Nepal. And he said to me, should I get certified? And I said, well, it's going to cost you thousands, isn't it? He said, yes. And he said, the thing is, what happens, because it was hand knit, the workers would come in, he'd explain, like, we've got this style, gives them the yarn, they go off and do it. So he was like, I can't really mistreat them because they're in their homes. So I have to be honest, and it's a tricky one. I'm not a huge fan of certifications necessarily.
Yeah.
Which I know isn't very
I understand it though, in the point of, a lot of these factories can't afford them. So I get that. But I'm guessing you have relationships with knitwear factories because you've been doing this for a very long time. So I'm guessing and you can tell me if there's any other way too, if these factories don't have certifications, would it be helpful to work with someone like you that knows the factories, or what would be the antidote to that?
So there's that, and then just again developing a relationship with them. Do they seem? It sounds very airy fairy, but do they seem happy? And how late are they replying to emails? It's one of my measures. Being here, if I'm getting emails from them in my afternoon, I'm like, okay, so that's what, 9-10 o'clock at night for you. I start doing the maths of that doesn't seem healthy. Okay, we all work late sometimes, but so those, I guess my recommendation is developing a relationship and doing it human to human rather than necessarily going off certifications.
Yeah,
which can be helpful.
Yes, I get it from a cut and sew perspective too, though, because we have, especially here in Los Angeles, we have a lot of smaller boutique-like factories that are doing great work and they're doing things ethically, but you're right, they can't afford those certifications and things like that. But because I am here, I can go visit in person. I can see how workers are being treated and how the environment is in the actual place that they're sewing and all of that. So I think same thing with knitwear factories, even if you're able to go in person, I think that would be helpful to just see how their operations run, how, are they comfortable even,
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Totally, yeah. And it's a whole, when you go into a factory, I always say it's a bit like walking into a school. It's that same, you can tell a good school when you walk into it, and it's the same with a factory. It's, I don't know, vibes.
Yeah. You know what? I think that's so practical. It is.
And I was going to add that there are increasingly, certainly in the UK, more and more small kind of, what would you call them, like sample rooms, where people might have a couple of Shima or Stoll machines and they'll have usually no MOQs, but a development charge. So you pay for that person to sit and do the programming, and then they'll knit it there on the spot. So that is one route as well that people could consider, where it's, yeah, essentially no MOQs, but then there's the sample development charge.
Yeah, and I would find that this is probably great for emerging designers because you don't have to worry about, all of the things that comes with those larger MOQs. I'm curious with those, kind of sample rooms and those smaller places, would it be the same process finding them as you would a huge factory?
Yeah, yeah, Google search or LinkedIn or,
Yeah.
yeah, finding them, getting in touch and saying, here's my idea, and working with them that way.
Yeah. So we touched a little bit about sustainability when we were talking about the certifications, but I want to kind of expand on that more because I know that is something that not only is a topic that my audience is interested in, but I think it's just, thankfully becoming the norm of the industry and something that's almost, required for designers now. And so I'm curious what role sustainability plays in the work that you do and how designers, emerging designer startups can incorporate that, when it comes to knitwear and creating sustainable pieces. I think a lot of times, when people think knitwear and you go to stores, you see a lot of polyester being used, which we know is not sustainable. And so, any thoughts on that?
Obviously, yes.
Or acrylic?
So obviously, acrylic gets used a lot in knitwear, and
Yeah.
it's petrol, so not great. But the joy of knitwear is that you can do it in wool or cashmere or cotton, and then all of that is more sustainable. You can also, so increasingly, there's a lot of recycle options with wool and cashmere. So recycled cashmere is becoming more and more popular.
Mhm.
And that's where they have literally taken both consumer waste, pulled it apart, sorted a red pile and a green pile, and then spun it back together. So I will also preface that by saying that you do get issues with pilling with the recycled
Mm.
cashmere because that yarn's been broken, so the fibers are shorter. Now, some people can do that and they can put a hang tag on it and get around it that way, but that's an issue. So then sort of back to the certifications, there's the SFA, which is the Sustainable Fibre Alliance, and that's generally for cashmere, that the cashmere goats have been treated right, the herders have been paid a fair price. So I would say SFA certified cashmere, and likewise RWS certified wool, and then organic cotton, so all of that can start with your fiber choices.
Yeah, and I'm curious, let's say a factory that you're working with doesn't have these options available. Would it make sense to source it, outsource it, and bring it in to whatever factory you're working with? Because I know you can go to textile trade shows and, there's a lot of suppliers of different yarns and things like that. Would that be a wise option?
Yep, that's totally doable. Yeah, you can specify, do you want it herb dyed? Do you want it recycled? And usually a good factory will happily get that for you.
Yeah. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on recycled polyester? Because I see that a lot and I see that being touted as sustainable a lot when it comes to knitwear. So, any personal thoughts on recycled polyester?
Yeah, I think we really like the word recycled, don't we?
We do. It makes us feel better.
Yeah, yeah. My inclination would be to go with a natural fiber over recycled polyester. Although, yeah, it's coming through a lot, and you do see a lot of blends that use it. It can be quite nice. It can be quite soft, but I would veer towards, wool, cashmere, cotton, alpaca, silk, all of that away from the recycled polyester.
Yes. Thank you for your thoughts. I wanted to touch on something you mentioned briefly before. I wasn't going to ask this, but I'm just curious. You spoke about a factory in Nepal that does hand knitting. And so I'm curious when it comes to hand knitting and, going with a factory that is using machines and that kind of thing, why would one choose one over the other? Is it the look? Can the machines not really fully replicate the look of a hand knit? What would be the reason?
Yeah, that you want that sort of handmade look,
Mm.
that there is something different about a hand knit to a machine knit. And on that subject, there isn't really such a thing as a crochet machine. So that when you see the cheap crochet that is out there with fast fashion in Temu and so on, that's been done It's not really crochet. It's more like embroidery.
Mm.
So something to be aware of if you see crochet is it can be done by machine, but if it's true crochet, it can only be done by hand.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So yeah, there are some things you can do in hand knitting that you can't really do on machine knitting and vice versa.
And
Um,
does that tend to be a higher cost for manufacturing? And I guess it
I,
depends on the location too, right? Because Nepal, I'm thinking is probably lower price point if you were to do it
yeah,
here.
yeah. So lower price point in Nepal or China, and possibly lower MOQs because you don't need to do machine programming, and it is just a pair of needles. It's a lower startup cost.
Yeah. And I'm curious as far as region while we're on the topic, is there certain regions that you would do certain techniques? Would you manufacture certain types of knit in China as opposed to, you know, wherever else in the US, or what would that look like?
So most of the cashmere fiber comes from Mongolia or Inner Mongolia.
Mm.
So there is a concentration of cashmere factories so Inner Mongolia is part of China. And then I guess out of Mongolia is its own country. And yes, cashmere factories tend to be concentrated around those. I suppose there's a lot of Italian factories and there's a certain Italian look that can be done. But yeah, otherwise it really depends what you want and what you want to achieve. And there's a concentration of cashmere factories in Nepal. So
Yeah.
Nepal, China, and Mongolia have the most, and then Bangladesh was sort of your higher volume, cheaper stuff. Not much knitting in India. Like I have a couple, but it's not. I don't know why. I've tried to ask a couple of people like, there's not much knitting in India.
Yeah.
Why?
That's so
Compared
interesting.
compared to like woven embroidery stuff, or
Yeah. They're big on embroidery there. And any advice that you would give to like aspiring designers looking to step into knit, specifically, fashion entrepreneurs? Any advice you would give
um,
them?
I guess one thing that I personally think, like, I wouldn't start with a basic because
Mm,
you are going to struggle to compete on price, next to say Uniqlo. Say you wanted to do, I don't know, a cashmere crew neck, your minimums are going to be so much lower than other ones that I would be more likely to go for some sort of standout piece that you feel passionate about, that you want to sell, than like, oh, I feel like I should do knitwear, so let's do a V-neck cardigan. That's my opinion.
yeah, no,
Um,
that's great advice.
and I do meet people sometimes, who are like, I want to start with something basic, and I think, why?
Yeah.
Why do something that's been done hundreds of times, thousands of times?
Yeah, no, that's great because I think also a lot of times people may put some knitwear pieces into a pre-existing cut and sew collection, right? And they want to play it safe and do that type of thing. But that makes so much sense because especially if you're working with smaller minimums, the price is going to go up, and you're right, you're going to be competing with people who can produce thousands and thousands of pieces who have a lower price point. And it's like, what is your differentiator? Why are people buying your piece over the other piece? So I think that's really great advice. I wasn't expecting that, but
Oh, really?
I love it. I want to kind of recap what we spoke about just to simplify the process for everyone. You can insert if I miss anything. So if a designer is looking to create a knitwear collection or add knitwear into their collection, the first thing they would do is maybe draft out their own sketch, find their own inspiration through different pieces that they like, and you can even Frankenstein pieces together, whether you like a sleeve on one thing and a length on the other thing, a certain knit inspiration or technique on something else. They can put all that together. They can bring you or any knitwear designer their inspiration and their sketches to bring it to life and then also create a tech pack for. We're skipping the pattern making process, which is amazing, and going straight into sampling, where the factory that they work with can create a sample, but even before creating the sample, give you a swatch of what that knit is going to look like. And then from there, you can kind of tweak or what have you before you create that sample and before the TOP sample, which is the top of production sample.
Yep, that's good.
You
Fresh
check
go.
off before production, and then you are good to go. And then also when it comes to sourcing different fibers, that's where we can avoid the piling issues and all of that, depending on what kind of fibers we're sourcing. And you mentioned that we can source direct from factory, but if they don't have what we need, it can also be outsourced. And then you also spoke about the fibers that we can choose that are sustainable as opposed to the manufacturing process, because the manufacturing process is sustainable by nature because we're knitting from thread instead of cutting fabric and trying to eliminate waste in that way. Did I
Yeah,
miss anything?
yeah. No, I think you've nailed it. I think you're ready to go.
Amazing.
Good to go.
I'm ready to produce my knitwear collection. Amazing. Okay, so if a designer is interested in working with you, and you've worked with some amazing brands and have so much experience in this industry, which is amazing, and so I know they're in good hands, but if they're interested in working with you, what would be the first steps? How can they find you? All of that.
So my website is thecashmeredesigner.com. I'm on Instagram as the Cashmere Designer and LinkedIn as Kate Knight. So all of those places you should be able to find me and yeah, have a chat.
Amazing. And you don't have to be in person to work with you, right? Like they don't have to be in person. You can work with people from US, from wherever. You're in Paris and that sounds lovely. I would love to come work with you in person, but yeah.
I've had 2 person meetings in 3 years.
Wow.
So, yeah, I really do work mostly remotely. I tend to work with Americans, Brits, Aussies, and sort of a mixture in between. And yeah, I can be flexible with time zones and that kind of jazz. So
yeah, which is really reassuring because they can trust that they can get, their ideas clearly brought to life even through online communication. I think it also just like takes a weight off. There's so many other things that we have to worry about as designers. So it's just reassuring to know that if you're looking to do something in knitwear that you're not only designing, you're doing tech packs and also able to refer people to the correct factories and advise on the design too. I think that's the issue that we kind of come across when we're trying to do things ourselves is like, if you're not skilled in the area of knitwear, you don't really know what to look for, right? You don't know what can actually go wrong. And it's not the factory's responsibility to tell you like, hey, like you may not want to do 18 colors or whatever. They're just going to do what you say. And so I love that about having someone that has the expertise. And so I am so grateful for the work that you do and for just your time and coming on here and just educating us on all things knitwear. And I'm so excited because by the time that this episode airs, you would have taught a lesson in our Make Good Fashion Academy, which I'm super excited about. So super grateful for you on that. And thank you so much, Kate, for being on.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
If you're someone who's ready to start a knitwear fashion brand or a fashion brand in general, you have to check out the Make Good Fashion Academy. The Make Good Fashion Academy is our step-by-step comprehensive course that teaches you how to start and launch a purpose-driven fashion brand from the ground up. In the Academy, you will find lessons from fashion industry experts like Kate Knight, who is also giving away a free consultation to all Make Good Fashion Academy students. If you're interested in learning more or enrolling, head over to makegoodfashion.com/academy to learn more.